All rise, veuillez vous lever. Please be seated, veuillez vous asseoir.
Good afternoon, welcome back. So the floor is of the Office of the Prosecutor to respond on Rule 122. Mr. MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Your Honors. Just to note the arrival of two new colleagues for this session, Mrs. Hernandez and also Mrs. Ngadire. Mrs. Von Braun will be responding to the defense's arguments. Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome to your new colleagues. Mr. Van Braun, please.
Mr. President, Your Honors, thank you for giving me the opportunity to briefly respond to the defense submissions pursuant to Rule 122.3. Mr. Prosecutor has already addressed some of the issues raised by the defense, so I will be very brief and I will also not repeat any of his submissions. Let me first address, though, the challenges to the DCC and related to the specificity of the charges. Contrary to the defense submissions, the charges, Your Honors, are set out in a clear, exhaustive, and self-contained manner. They are as specific as possible in the circumstances and unambiguous. The factual scope of the charged crimes is outlined, and Mr. Said has been provided sufficient notice of what he has been charged with to prepare his defense. As required by the Chamber's Practice Manual, the statute, the rules of evidence and procedure, the DCC sets out the material facts, alleged crimes, temporal, geographical scope of the crimes, identified, and total number of victims for each incident. Objective and subjective elements of the applicable modes. And finally, the counts make clear which crimes are charged for these material facts. The pre-confirmation brief complements the document containing the charges. It is the document that summarizes and cites the evidence. These citations, along with the evidence cited there, have to be read, of course. The requirement of the DCC is to set out the material facts, not a narrative of a story. Of course, Your Honors, the material facts of an incident can constitute both a war crime and a crime against humanity. This has been adjudicated frequently also by this court. Let me briefly touch on the charge of other inhumane acts, as this is an issue specifically raised by the defense. Contrary to the defense assertion, the prosecution has set out exactly what it deems to constitute such acts. For example, count 12 expressly states that it is the deplorable detention conditions and the refusal to acknowledge the whereabouts or fate of the detainees at Sadat to the family members which constitute these other inhumane acts. The defense assertion that Article 7.1k violates the principle of legality is unfounded, and indeed, they cite no legal authority for this position. I also want to be clear, because it was raised by the defense, Mr. Said is not being charged for any participation, individual criminal responsibility related to crimes committed during the Boy Rob operations. The evidence, though, that he was present at both operations has been disclosed to the parties during the course of the pretrial proceedings. It is nothing new, but there is no expansion in any way of the charges. On the allegations made by the defense, in respect to disclosure, I refer back to what Mr. Prosecutor has submitted before the break. In fact, the prosecution has addressed these issues on numerous occasions in the course of the pretrial proceedings. While the defense is speculating about information and evidence that they have allegedly not received, they failed to make a specific request or demonstrate how any such materials relate to a live issue in this case. Mr. President, Your Honors, it is Mr. Said who is charged because of the evidence we hold to establish his individual criminal responsibility, and Mr. Said only. It has never and will never be persuasive to argue that others may also have committed crimes at the same time or before or after the period relevant to the charges. To be sure, Mr. Said is not the only one allegedly responsible for crimes committed during the conflict in CAR, on the Seleka side or any other side. He is not here because he is seemingly a more low-level member of the former Seleka coalition, but because the evidence demonstrates his individual criminal responsibility. The defense has launched quite serious allegations against the prosecution in its investigation today. These have no basis. To finalize this point very briefly, I request to go into private session.
Mr. Court Officer, we'll move into private session, please.
We're back in open session, Mr. President.
Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you. The other individuals referenced by the defense were also interviewed, including on broad aspects of the conflict, relevant beyond what is immediately relevant to the case at hand. Thus, Your Honors, I conclude my brief response by reiterating that the charges set out before you today are brought against Mr. Said for his acts and conduct. They are clear, defined, and exhaustive, and the defense has not managed to raise a significant doubt as to this assertion. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Okay, the chamber has taken note of the observations of the defense, of the response of the prosecution, and pursuant to Rule 122, paragraph 6 of the Rules of Procedure and Evidence, will rule on them in due course. Now we will proceed to hearing parties and participants' submissions on the merits. We'll start with the office of the prosecutor. You do have an hour and a half. I would be grateful if you make it by 4. In case you don't, please let me know. We'll see whether we can arrange as with the indulgence of the interpreters as a very small continuation after 4. But if you make it, this would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Honor. Our aim is to finish. My presentation is to last an hour 10 minutes, so before the deadline in question.
Very good to hear. Thank you.
It's intended to last an hour and 10 minutes.
Well, the caveat is less appreciated than the...
If you allow me just a second, I want to sort out the technical issues. I would kindly ask that we'd be allowed to show a PowerPoint presentation, and I understand it will be on Evidence Channel 2. So we shall all go to that channel if you so wish.
Yeah, you're allowed to do so.
Thank you, Your Honor. Alors, je vais m'adresser la Chambre
I
maintenant
will
en français.
address the chamber in
Et l'ensemble
French,
de ma présentation
and my presentation
sera fait dans cette langue.
will be done in French.
Je tiens à rassurer tous
I
et
would
chacun
like to assure
qu'aucune
everyone
session à huis clos
that
partielle ne
no
sera
closed
nécessaire.
or private session will be necessary,
Et si jamais,
and
pour
if
quelque raison que ce
it is
soit,
necessary for whatever
je commette un
reason,
impair, je suis
and
certain
I
que
do something that should not be done,
on pourra
then I am sure
excuser,
that it can be
si
redacted,
nécessaire,
if necessary,
la retransmission en différé.
and then retransmitted.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
Madame, Monsieur les juges,
Madam, Your Honours,
je vais exposer les moyens à charge
I-
concernant Monsieur
I will
Saïd.
highlight the charges relating to Mr.
La
Said.
Chambre a déjà pu
The
prendre
Chamber has
connaissance
already
de
been
notre
able to take
mémoire de
note
préconfirmation.
of our pre-confirmation
Alors, mes
brief.
observations
So my
aujourd'hui
observations today
vont se
will
concentrer sur les
focus
aspects
on the key aspects
des éléments de
of
preuve présentés par
evidence
l'accusation
presented by
à
the
l'appui
prosecution in
des faits
support
essentiels
of
sur
the
lesquels
vital
reposent
facts
les
which
charges.
formulates the basis of our charges.
Nous vous soumettons
The prosecution submits that there are substantial grounds to believe that Mr. Said committed the crimes of which he has been
et
accused
qu'il doit donc
and must
être envoyé
therefore
en jugement.
be referred to trial.
Les éléments de preuve
The
démontrent que
evidence
M.
will show
Saïd
that Mr.
est
Said
pénalement
is
responsable
criminally
des crimes de guerre et
liable
des
for
crimes
war
contre
crimes
l'humanité
and
commis
war
entre
crimes
avril
against
et novembre
humanity
2013
committed between April and November
dans 2
2013
sites de détention.
in 2 detention
Je vais
sites.
les répéter
I'm
en
going to
français malgré
repeat
le
them
fait que
in
mon collègue
French,
de l'OPCV l'ait fait.
although this has already been done, because I believe it's very important to remember it's the Central Office of Repression of Banditry,
donc connu sous
known
l'acronyme
as
OCRB.
OCRB,
Et l'autre endroit,
and
l'autre
the
site
other site
était le comité
was the Extraordinary Committee for the Defense of Acquired Democratic Rights, known as CEDAT.
Alors je vous invite à regarder vos écrans.
I call upon you to look upon your
Encore une fois,
screens. Once
nous pouvons
again,
voir
here again,
les crimes
we can see the
présumés
alleged
commis
crimes
à
committed
l'OCRB.
at
Je
OCRB.
ne vais pas les relire.
I'm not going to read them
Ils sont
out,
devant vous, mais il
They are
s'agit donc
before
des
you,
chefs
but they are
à
grounds 1 to
en
7
vertu de l'article 7 et 8 du statut,
relating
à
to
savoir
Article
de
7 and
guerre,
8 as regards war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Sur la prochaine
On
diapo, vous pouvez
the
voir
next slide,
maintenant les
you can
crimes
see the
reprochés
crimes,
et
the
allégués
alleged
commis au
crimes
CEDAD.
committed in CEDAD.
Il s'agit encore
Here,
une fois de
once
7
again,
chefs,
There are 7 grounds
toujours sous l'article 7 et
against
8
under
du statut.
Article 7 and 8 of the statutes, crimes against humanity and war crimes.
Les charges reposent
The
sur des
charges
éléments
are
de preuve
supported
allant de
by
plusieurs
evidence
témoins
given by
qui
several
sont
insider
ceux que l'on appelle
witnesses,
dans notre jargon témoins
or what we call in
insiders,
French témoins
des
initiés,
documents
and also by documents,
vidéos
videos,
et des
and
photographies.
photographs.
Mais surtout,
But above all,
elle repose
it
sur
is
les récits
based
des
on the
victimes
narratives of
elles-mêmes.
victims themselves.
Les victimes ont
The
fourni
victims
des récits
provided
déchirants de leur
horrendous
souffrance
accounts
aux
of their
mains de
suffering
Saïd
at the hands of
et
Mr.
de ses
Said and
subordonnés
his subordinates and
collaborateurs.
collaborators,
Et je vais
which
résumer
I will now
que je vais
briefly
résumer succinctement
summarize
aujourd'hui.
today.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr.
Mesdames,
President,
Messieurs les juges,
Madam, Your
ma
Honours,
présentation
my
portera tout d'abord sur
presentation
les
will
éléments
firstly
de preuve
focus on the evidence
à l'appui des
which
éléments
supports the constitutive
du
elements
chapeau
under
des
the chapter
articles
of
relatifs
articles
aux crimes de
on
guerre et
war
crimes contre
crimes
l'humanité.
and crimes against humanity, if you allow me.
Je décrirai
I will
ensuite
then
le rôle
describe
de
the
M.
role
Saïd
of Mr.
à
Said
l'OCRB
at
et par la
OCRB
suite au
and
CEDAD.
then later at CEDAD,
Donc, les deux endroits où les crimes
the two
reprochés ont été
areas
commis
where the
en
alleged
2013.
crimes were committed in 2013.
Enfin, je
And
reviendrai sur
finally,
les crimes
I will
commis
return to the list
dans
of
ces
crimes
deux lieux
committed in these
de
2
détention
detention sites
et également
and
décrirai
provide
brièvement
evidence
les éléments de preuve à l'appui
proving
des contributions de
Mr.
M.
Said's
Saïd.
involvement in
à
the
ces
commissioning of these crimes.
Alors, laissez-moi débuter
Let me start out
par les crimes constitutifs
by
du chapeau de
the
l'article
crimes
relatif aux crimes de
under
guerre.
war crimes.
Les crimes de guerre ont été
War
commis
crimes
entre
were committed
avril
between
et novembre
April
2013.
and November
Tout
2013.
au long de cette période,
Throughout
un
this
conflit
period, an
armé
internal
interne
armed conflict
faisait rage en
was
République
consuming the
centrafricaine.
Central African Republic.
Le conflit a
This
commencé
conflict started
toutefois bien avant les
well
crimes
before
reprochés
the
et s'est
alleged crimes
poursuivi
and continued
suite,
for many months
également pendant
thereafter.
À la fin
At the
2012,
end of 2012, François
était
Bozizé
alors
was president
de la République
of the Central
centrafricaine.
African Republic.
Le procureur ce matin a rappelé
The
qu'il avait
prosecutor
pris
this morning
lui-même
recalled
le pouvoir
that
suite à un
he
coup d'État
seized
en
power.
mars
It was
2003.
a coup d'etat which took place in March 2003.
L'une des parties
One of the
au conflit
parties
armé
to the
était
armed
une
conflict
coalition
was a coalition
rassemblant
of
plusieurs
various
factions
political
politiques et
factions
de groupes armés
and armed groups
appelés la Seleka.
known as Seleka.
Monsieur Saïd
Mr. Said
appartenait à ce
belonged to this group.
groupe. Deux des principaux
Two
chefs
of
de
the
la
main
Seleka
leaders of
étaient
the
Monsieur
Seleka
Michel
were Michel
Jotodia
Jotodia
et Noureddin Adam.
and Nuruddin Adam.
De l'autre côté,
The other party
l'autre partie au conflit
to the
armé
armed
était un
conflict
groupe de forces
was
loyales
a group
à la cause
loyal
du
to the
président
cause of President
Bozizé.
Bozizé,
Nous les appellerons
and
les
we
forces
know them as
pro-Bozizé.
the pro-Bozizé forces.
Au cours du conflit,
During
les
the
forces
conflict,
pro-Bozizé
the pro-Bozizé
ont été
forces
réorganisées
reorganized
afin d'intégrer des
themselves in
groupes
order to
d'autodéfense
include self-defense
préexistants
groups which already existed
ou nouvellement créés.
or were newly created.
Ces groupes ont
These
évolué au cours
groups
du conflit et
evolved
sont
during the
devenus
conflict and became
ce que l'on connaîtra
what
comme
we
étant
know
les
as
anti-Balaka.
anti-Balaka.
Les dirigeants
The
du
leaders
groupe
of the group
comprenaient
included
et des
Bozizé
membres de son cercle
and members
rapprochés,
of his inner circle,
dont
including
Lévi Yakete,
Levi Yakete,
Patrice-Édouard
Patrice-Edouard
Ngaïsona,
Gaissona,
Bernard
Bernard
Mokom,
Mokom,
Maxime
Maxime
Mokom
Mokom,
et
and
Olivier
Olivier
Coudemont.
Coudemont.
Laissez-moi maintenant revenir
Allow
sur
me
certains
to
points
revert
clés
to
du conflit.
some key points in the conflict.
Vers le mois d'août
Towards the
2012,
month of August 2012,
la coalition rebelle
the
Seleka
Seleka
a fait son
rebel
apparition
coalition
dans le
emerged down in
de la
the
République
northern
centrafricaine.
eastern part of the Central African Republic.
Cette coalition
This
était
coalition
unie
was
notamment par un
unified
sentiment
in particular
d'insatisfaction
by a feeling
envers
of dissatisfaction against Bozizé
et son désir
and their
de le
desire
chasser du pouvoir.
to oust him from power.
Le 24 mars
The
2013,
24th of
la
March
Seleka a pris le
2013, the
contrôle de
Seleka
Bangui.
took over the control of Bangui
Après avoir
after
vaincu
having
les forces
defeated the
nationales
national
et troupes
forces
sud-africaines.
and the South African troops.
Elle a renversé Bozizé,
They toppled Bozizé,
avec ses
who,
alliés,
with his
a
allies,
été poussé
were
à
forced into exile.
l'exil. Le chef
The leader
de la
of the
Seleka,
Seleka,
Michel
Michel
Jotodia,
Jotodia,
s'est autoproclamé
proclaimed
président
himself
de la
as
République
president of the
centrafricaine.
Central African Republic.
L'attaque de la Seleka
The
sur
Seleka
Bangui
attack
a
on
révélé ses
Bangui
compétences
exposed
et
its
forces
strengths and
militaires.
military forces.
Elle a contraint
They
Bozizé et
forced
ses
Bozizé
alliés à
and his
battre en
allies
retrait,
to retreat,
et le conflit a
and
temporairement
temporarily the conflict
connu une période
was less
d'affrontement moins
intense.
intense. Mais
But
elle n'a
it
pas mis fin
did not put
à la
an
guerre,
end to the war.
car honorable juge,
Your Honours,
il n'y a eu aucun
there was
règlement
no
pacifique du
peaceful
conflit.
settlement to the conflict.
Il n'y a eu aucune
There was
absence
no
durable
sustainable
d'affrontement armé
absence of
entre
armed
les parties
conflict
au conflit.
between the warring parties.
Et plus,
And in
il y a
addition to
eu
that,
clairement une reprise
there was
des
clearly
affrontements
a
armés
resumption
entre
of
les
armed
deux mêmes
clashes
parties au
between the
conflit.
two parties in the conflict.
Après la prise de Bangui,
After taking over Bangui,
la Seleka
the Seleka
anticipait
anticipated
une
a counterattack
contre-attaque et a immédiatement mis
and
en
immediately
place
put
un
into
plan pour
place
contrer
a plan
l'attaque.
to counter such an
De
attack.
leur côté,
From their side, Bozizé and his allies rapidly regrouped their fighters and provided support, training, as well as consolidating the self-defense groups with the aim of taking power again by force. In any case, that is what they tried to do. A considerable number of experienced combatants remained loyal to Bozizé. Amongst them, you could find former members of the Central African Armed Forces, known as FACA, and also the Presidential Guard of Bozizé. Although the seizure of Bangui by the Seleka forced many combatants to leave Bangui, they withdrew intact. They had the time and force to hide and carry away stocks of military armaments. Several pro-Bozizé combatants regrouped themselves in the border regions of the Central African Republic, waiting an opportune moment to launch a counterattack. Certain forces loyal to Bozizé remained in Central African Republic and put up an armed resistance. Mr. President, Madam, Your Honours, here you can see the map on the screen. Initially, you can see Bangui. The town is close to the border with the Democratic Republic of the Congo. When Bangui was captured by the Seleka, Bozizé and his close allies fled to Yaoundé, the capital of Cameroon. Several pro-Bozizé combatants also withdrew to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, below the Ubangi River, in a town called Zongo. Other combatants withdrew in zones close to the border with Cameroon. They gathered in areas like Batua and Garoua Boulay. These locations were strategically selected because they were close to the main supply axes between Cameroon, Yaoundé was the capital, and Bangui. Some weeks after having fled Bangui, Bozizé organized high-level meetings to plan his return to power. Those working with him communicated with the self-defense groups which already existed and the new recruits in order to organize them, to arm them, and to train them. In our PCB, and shows other examples, but from June 2013, structured military-like training with former members of FACA took place in areas such as Zongo and Kolongo in RDC and Gobere. And also in the Central African Republic, as you can see on the map. It was at this time that the pro-Bozizé forces started to fight back, including launching attacks against the Seleka. Different actors amongst the pro-Bozizé forces made significant inroads during this period, and the movement was known, as I've already stated, as anti-Balaka. However, it is the same armed group, Mr. President, which fought the Seleka continuously since the end of 2012. In the months that followed the seizing of power by the Seleka, the anti-Balaka launched major attacks and started to retake territories in the hands of the Seleka. Again, in our PCB, and I quote this by way of an example, a significant anti-Balaka attack took place in September 2013 in Basangoa. The 5th of December 2013, the anti-Balaka launched a coordinated attack of a large scale in Bangui with the aim of ousting the Seleka. Long-term allies of Mr. Bozizé, including Maxime Ocom and Alfred Yekatom, supervised this attack on Bangui. I'm being told that perhaps I'm speaking a little too fast. I think that the English transcript, no doubt, has now caught up with me. Within some weeks, Michel Djotodoya, particularly under international pressure, was forced to resign, and Seleka had to retreat. Nevertheless, the hostilities between anti-Balaka and the Seleka continued throughout the year 2014, well beyond the period relating to the charges against Mr. Said. Your Honours, the details in our PCB and the time of the alleged facts, there was an armed conflict of a non-international state. Now, I will look at the contextual evidence of the crimes against humanity. During the period of the charges, evidence in our case shows that Seleka carried out a widespread and systematic attack and in pursuit of a policy of state or an organization against a civilian population of Bangui perceived as supporters of the Bozizé cause. As I have just mentioned, after having taken power in March 2013, the Seleka knew that Bozizé and his allies were actively seeking to return to power. The Seleka knew very well that a persistent threat existed for their government. To counter that, the Seleka undertook to suppress all resistance to their government. They made no distinctions between peaceful political opponents and genuine threats to their security. On the contrary, they targeted all perceived supporters of Bozizé. The Seleka identified the presumed supporters of Bozizé by basing themselves on a variety of factors which they considered as indicative of support for Mr. Bozizé. They targeted in particular Christians, individuals of Gabaya, Manja, or Banda ethnicity, former members of FACA or the Presidential Guard, and fourthly, residents of certain neighborhoods in Bangui, traditionally supporting Bozizé. The crimes committed by Mr. Said and his subordinates at OCRB and SEDAD were part of this attack. I will return soon to the details of these crimes in the two detention sites, but before doing that, allow me to describe other incidents which occurred during the attacks, including 4 additional incidents outlined in the document of charges, where we have the contextual elements of these elements. These additional events were a part of the attack against the civilian population and are as follows. And they occurred in Bangui. In April 2013, the Seleka launched an offensive against the 7th arrondissement of Bangui. In April 2013, again, the Seleka carried out its first operation in the Boy-Rob neighborhood. In August 2013, the Seleka carried out a second operation in the Boy-Rab neighborhood. And finally, between April and July, in July 2013, there was an attack on minibus passengers at a checkpoint at PK9. You can see this on the map, and I'd like to draw your attention and submit to you that there is a Smith's error in our Annex B in our PCB, where PK9 is not indicated correctly. But here on the map on your screen, it is correct. So this was a mistake with the GPS, which we will amend and correct in the annex in written submissions as soon as possible. I'll continue. The offensive against the 7th arrondissement and the operations carried out in the Boy-Rab neighborhood were large-scale attacks launched in residential areas which were densely populated. It is not security operations aiming to neutralize combatants. Why? How? An examination of the type of victims and the type of crimes commissioned shows this abundantly. The Seleka knowingly targeted old people, women, and young children. Your Honours, on the screen, you can see a woman whose name was Sandrine and her baby, who were beaten by the Seleka in their own home during an operation carried out in the Boy-Rab neighborhood in April 2013. During this very same operation, the Seleka raped several women. These are targeted and systematic acts. By way of an example, a victim describes that they were collectively raped over several days under the order of a military chief of the Seleka. Your Honours, this rape was an act of pure revenge against a family suspected of supporting Bouzize. During the events surrounding the 7th arrondissement and the Boy-Rab neighborhood, the Seleka went from door to door, completely looting all houses. There again, these acts were carried out systematically. The looting committed in Boy-Rab lasted for several days, and hundreds of Seleka elements participated. The Seleka also used informants who pointed out the location of houses where non-Muslims lived. These houses and their occupants were the targets of violence, whereas the houses of Muslims were saved. Other witnesses described that the Seleka arbitrarily seized men and boys in the street and forced them to lie down on the ground in a line and executed them one by one. Witnesses described how, during the second major operation carried out in the Boyrab neighborhood in August 2013, they just Similarly, in July 2013, Seleka arbitrarily arrested, tortured, and then killed a group of passengers on a minibus at the checkpoint of PK9. What had these victims done? These victims were passengers in a bus where the Seleka had found a bag containing T-shirts with a logo or face of Mr. Bouzize. Mr. President, Madam, Your Honours, the alleged crimes were committed by applying and in the pursuit of a state policy or an organization. This can be seen by the pattern, a pattern constant where the targeted civilian population were victims in the hands of the Seleka. The commanders and members of the Seleka, regardless of their ethnic or national affiliations, worked together and attacked the civilian population of Bangui, perceived as supporters of Bouzize, and made many victims. Once again, by way of an example, Adam and high-ranking commanders were present on the ground. They gave the orders during the operations, which took place over several days. The state or organization policy is also shown by the words and gestures of the Seleka commanders during the coordination of the attack. Again, Noureddin Adem at that time indeed was a Minister of Public Security, and the superior of Mr. Said stated that Boyrab must be burnt down. This is witness 1719. He also said that the victims of OCRB, and I quote, "They are beasts who supported Bouzize." Witness P0622. The crimes committed at OCRB and at Sedad, which you can now see on your screen, are part of this attack. The crimes committed at OCRB and Sedad were also planned, coordinated, and supervised by military leaders of the Seleka. They were executed according to a systematic mode of operation. They were carried out in a regular fashion over a prolonged period, creating many victims. Allow me now before looking at the alleged crimes, to describe the role of Mr. Said at OCRB and SEDAD. After having taken control of Bangui by the Seleka on or around the 12th of April 2013, Mr. Said was nominated de facto head of the central office of the OCRB by Mr. Noureddin Adam, who was then the Minister of Public Security. You have seen the decrees. It's on the lists. It is in the document that you have as part of our prosecution submissions. OCRB is a police unit in the center of Bangui, and indeed a pre-existing Central African institution, as mentioned by our colleague. It did pre-exist before they took control of Bangui. On the screen, you can see an aerial view of the OCRB. It's a satellite image of a well-known site, which goes back to 2013. So this is the year in question. Together with his deputy, Mahamat Tahir, and his close collaborators, Hissène Dambucha and Soumayele Yaya, Mr. Said was at the head of more than 60 elements of the Seleka, and at that center between the 12th of April and the 31st of August 2013. On the screen, you can see a list of members of Seleka produced or compiled at the time the facts took place and authenticated by an insider witness. And this list shows that Mr. Said was the one who was responsible. You can see the name of Mr. Said, which is in position number 1, and also that of Mahamat Tahir, who is number 2. Once again, Mr. President, Madam, Your Honors, these are documents when the actual facts took place. Other Selekas of high rank were in regular contact with Mr. Said at OCRB, including... Sorry, I do apologize. Forgive me. Please give me one moment. Yes, that's right. So other high-ranking Seleka were in regular contact with Mr. Said at the OCRB, for example, Mr. Hissène Dambucha, Mahamat Said Abdel Kani, that's his full name, and Mr. Adoum Rakis. Evidence will show that Mr. Said was the most influential member of Seleka at OCRB. Mr. Seleka exercised his control on the OCRB until the end of August 2013, when the Seleka were chased out of the OCRB because of the alleged crimes committed. Mr. Adam, his superior, was dismissed from his functions or duties as minister and appointed director of SEDAD, once again, by decree on the 22nd of August 2013. This is part of our document and submissions. For his part, the building of SEDAD was in a villa in a residential area on the outskirts of the center of Bangui. Once again, you can see an image of this taken by satellite, taken in 2013. The inside witnesses describe Mr. Said as a commander of operations for Adam, and in that title he had the authority on the Seleka who were working in the OCRB. Mr. Said received and carried out the orders of Adam. Mr. Said recruited former Selikas of the OCRB and transferred them to the SEDAD. Mr. Said organized and supervised the patrols responsible for arresting victims and even participated in their arrests. According to the decree number 13118, SEDAD was an intelligent gathering service to fight against threats affecting the national security. However, the Selika, under the aegis of Adam, changed the SEDAD into a detention center, a secret detention center with no judicial control. Mr. Said and his subordinates permitted fear and suffering to occur to the detainees and their families until the 8th of November 2013, at least to that date. Allow me to return now to the OCRB and describe the crimes that were committed. Once I've described those crimes, I will turn to the question of individual criminal liability of Mr. Said. In paragraph 33 of the DCC and paragraph 141 to 200 of the PCB, the prosecution has described the salient facts and evidence to support the charges for grounds 1 to 7. On the screen, you can find the image of the surroundings of the OCRB. You can see the main entrance. The compound is surrounded by high walls, and it has 7 ground cells. On this image, you can see the inside of one of these cells, from the door to the back and the other way around, and you can see the doors open here. I would like to point out that this is 2016, during a mission of the prosecution to this very site. So they are not photos which date to 2013. Between the 12th of April 2013 and his departure in the 31st of August 2013, Mr. Said and his deputy and his close collaborators arrested and detained perceived supporters of Bozizé in the ground cells, as well as the cell under his office. The detainees were mainly men, Christians, and belonging to certain ethnic groups traditionally allied to the Bozizé cause. Furthermore, some detainees carried out professions or occupied positions which were deemed to be linked to Bozizé or his former government. These men were deprived of their fundamental rights. They were arbitrarily arrested, subject to inhumane detention conditions, and were deprived of any review on the legality of their detention. The prisoners were detained in horrendous conditions. The cells were overcrowded. About 12 to 15 detainees were squashed together in the cells. These cells were small, suffocating, and no window, with a single bucket used as a toilet. They only received scant or no food and water, which forced them to drink their own urine. The detainees were frightened, starved, thirsty, and unable to sleep.
Le témoin
Witness
P622
P0622
déclare,
stated,
et je cite,
and I quote,
il était
"It
impossible
was
de se
impossible
coucher à même le sol,
to
car la cellule était
lie down
remplie."
because the
Fin de la citation.
cell was so full."
Le témoin
End of quote.
ajoute, et je
The witness
cite,
added, and I quote,
j'avais
"I
tellement
was
soif
so
que je n'avais
thirsty
pas
that I had no
d'autre
other
choix que de
alternative
boire
but
mon
to
urine."
drink my own
Fin
urine."
de la citation.
End of citation.
Au cours de la
During,
période
during
concernée
the
par les
period in
accusations,
question,
au moins
at
31
least 31
détenus de sexe
detainees
masculin ont
who were
également
male
été détenus
were
dans
also
la cellule
detained
connue
in the cell
sous le nom de
which was known
trou,
as
sous-sol.
trou or the hole.
Monsieur le procureur a décrit ce
The
matin
prosecution
les
described
conditions
this morning
atroces
the
dans lesquelles les
atrocious
victimes
conditions
étaient
in
détenues.
which the victims were detained.
Je n'y reviens donc
So I
pas.
won't go back to that.
Mais il a cependant-
However,
il est
it is
important de
important
noter
to note
que la présence
that
des
the
détenus
presence
dans ce
of
trou
the
était
detainees
tenue
in
secrète,
this hole was kept
secrète des
secret,
visites des
secret
autorités.
from any visits from the authorities.
Le témoin
Witness P0547 said there was no trace whatsoever of their detention in the registers of the OCRB. Commander Yaya told his men that if any relatives came inquiring about the victims, they should say that they had been taken elsewhere. This is the statement of P0547. Depriving the rights of detention, the inhuman detention conditions, and the arbitrary character of the arrests meet all the requirements of the elements of a crime of imprisonment which make up a crime against humanity. However, the poor treatment given to the detainees went far beyond the inhumane conditions. Mr. Said and his collaborators made at least 16 male detainees were subjected to the method of torture known as abatacha. Mr. President, Your Honours, this morning you saw the horrible wounds caused by this method. The detainees were attached or tied according to this method, not only attached in this method, which is torture in itself, but also they were beaten so that they could extract information or confessions. Atabacha or simply were beaten without the abacha mecha, but they were beaten, and witnesses confirmed that they could no longer walk, they couldn't use their limbs, some were even paralyzed temporarily. Others had discolored arms and couldn't even feed themselves anymore. Others were so exhausted that they needed help to change position, and others, again, suffered from infections. Your Honours, this method fall under the elements of crime of torture, making up a crime against humanity and a war crime. Furthermore, this method in question caused extreme pain, but a method meant that the position was designed to have them in a humiliating and degrading position, which means it also is a crime which is an outrage on human dignity, which is a war crime. As I've already said, other forms of bad treatment reached the level of torture and were also inflicted in the OCRB. This means intensive beatings with whips, planks, the butt of rifles, kicks,
creating open wounds. One of the detainees, P2263, arrested in July 2013, stated, and I quote, "They gave us the order, one by one, to lie down on the ground on our stomachs. I heard them say to their men in Sango to beat us and to put us in the cells. The Seleka took a 20-liter petrol can filled with water and mixed the water with soil, which was next to us. One by one, we had to submit this ritual, which I'm now going to describe. We had to lie down, and they mixed water and mud on our back. Then they added stones coming from the ground. I think it was to worsen the pain. The Seleka then came with rope, usually used to attach cows. They beat us with the rope. They beat us on our backs one by one. When one of them was tired, another took over. The order was to whip us, each one of us, 20 times. They restarted if someone made noise whilst they were beating us. During these beatings, I had to urinate on myself. I know that someone defecated in their underwear. The Seleka also inflicted serious mental suffering by threatening to kill the detainees. The proof reveals that Mr. Said himself, vis-à-vis a witness, carried out a simulation of execution to a detainee which he accused of supporting Mr. Bozizé. The torture at OCRB was practiced in order to inflict physical pain and psychological sufferings and to obtain information or confirmations, to punish, intimidate, or to stop the detained persons. During the period under questions, the tortured detainees were under the guard and control of the Seleka, who were the subordinates of Mr. Said. The prisoners detained in OCRB were all out of combat or were civilians, members of medical staff or religious staff, and did not actively take part in the hostilities. And finally, the Seleka targeted victims because of their identity, their religion, their ethnic affiliation, and their gender. The victims were selected as targets for political motives because they were considered as supporters of the former President Bozizé. Mr. Said himself accused the witnesses of supporting Bozizé. Subordinates and collaborators also said such statements vis-à-vis the detainees during the cross-examination and during their bad treatments. Furthermore, the evidence shows that the ethnic, religious, and gender motives can be invoked on the basis of evidence available. The victims were largely from certain ethnic groups, just, for example, the Gebaya. They were Christians. The victims were almost exclusively men. The discriminatory intention of Mr. Said was established, but the operation mode of the crimes committed against victims, which is described in paragraph 33 of the notification of charges. Mr. President, Madam, Your Honors, the evidence summarized in the PCB clearly establishes the existence of substantial grounds to believe that the crimes of imprisonment, torture, cruel treatment, and other inhuman acts, outrages to the dignity of the person, and finally persecution were committed against detainees at OCRB.
Je note qu'il y a peut-être des expurgations.
I would like to point out that there might be ongoing reductions, and I'm sorry.
Effectivement d'être prudent.
And it is better to be cautious indeed.
Laissez-moi maintenant.
Now, let me briefly.
I agree, it is better to be cautious.
Je vais maintenant.
I will now turn to
quelques éléments
some elements
au niveau de des modes
regarding
de responsabilité.
The modes of liability.
Alors, Monsieur Said est
Mr. Said is charged for crimes which he committed under modes of responsibility pursuant to Articles 25, 3A, B, C, and D. However, for the purposes of my presentation, I will only summarize the evidence relating to Article 25.3a because these elements of evidence also apply to the modes of liability in the alternative provided for under Article 25.3 B, C, and D. We respectfully, Mr. President, ask your chamber to confirm the charges under these four modes of liability and to leave the ultimate decision on this question to the trial chamber if you came to confirm the charges. Your Honors, the evidence on the case file show that Mr. Said participated in the alleged crimes committed at OCRD as a direct co-perpetrator in the meaning of Article 25.3a. As provided for in paragraphs 201 and 242 of our DCC, Mr. Said had a plan or an agreement with, and I quote, the following persons. Their names will appear on the screen. Mr. Mahamat Nuruddin Adam, who was Mr. Said's superior. Mr. Mahamat Tahir, his deputy. Mr. Soumayele Yaya, the most trusted collaborator of his. Mr. Mahamat Saleh, a high-ranking official of the Seleka. Mr. Hisen Sandebucha, a high-ranking personality within the Seleka and also deputy to Saleh. Adum Rakiz, Deputy Chief of the Central African Police, and finally Mr. Fadul Al-Bachar, Deputy Chief of SEDAD. And as well, there were also other Seleka of the OCRB. The agreement sought to target presumed supporters of Mr. Bozize by committing those crimes outlined in counts 1 to 7. The existence of such an agreement is not only established through the mutual and regular coordination in view of committing the crimes, but also in the execution of the same crimes. The execution of the crimes in itself discloses the existence of this coordination as well. Mr. Said exercised control on the commission of these crimes through his essential contribution to the agreement of the co-perpetrators. The prosecution relies on evidence from at least 9 insider witnesses who testify to the essential contribution of Mr. Said to the crimes. Furthermore, Several victims themselves described the direct participation of Mr. Said in their arrests and in the grievous mistreatments that they were subjected to. The testimonies of victims are also in part supported by documentary evidence. Throughout the entire period covered by the charges, Mr. Said was in control of OCRB. In that capacity, he ordered and supervised the arrest and detention of Mr. Bozize's supporters. He also ordered the detention of some of them in the cell which was called the Hole or the True, which was under his office. Mr. Said controlled access to that cell, which was located under his office. He was able to see, hear, or even smell the detainees who were under his own office. He was fully aware of the conditions of their detention and the total absence of regular judicial procedures in regard thereto. As you can see on your screen, there is an ordinance for the liberation of a detained person. It is signed by Mr. Said himself. The letter C stands for Colonel, and MSAK are the initials of Mr. Mahamat Said Abdel Kani. Now, Mr. President, Your Honors, Mr. Said authorized the Arbachacha torture methods and said to the staff of OCRD that this was the best means of obtaining confessions, as you will see in our brief at paragraph 226 to 235. Mr. Said provided weapons, food, vehicles, uniforms, and identity cards to the Seleka. On your screen, you can see a sample of an identity card, and once again, you see the initials CMSAK, which refer to Colonel Mahamat Said Abdel Kani. Mr. Said was the Seleka leader when it came to operations that were carried out on the ground involving arrests. His telephone number, his mobile telephone number, was written on OCRB vehicles. With his subordinates Yaya and Tahi, Mr. Said also conducted violent interrogations from another office which was situated within the premises of OCRB. A witness described how he was subjected to a fake execution by Mr. Said himself. Mr. President, Your Honors, the evidence presented by the prosecution also demonstrate that Mr. Said contributed intentionally to the crimes charged and in full knowledge thereof. He was present at all times at OCRB during the period charged. Mr. Said was also the most influential Seleka personality stationed at OCRB. He gave orders and was the administrator of OCRB. The evidence will show that the underground cell was located in his office and that he ordered persons to be detained there. He also participated himself in arrests and in poor physical treatment of the detainees. He coordinated and communicated regularly with his elements who also maltreated the detainees. In other words, he had knowledge. Finally, when it comes to evidence in support of liability in the alternative, as I mentioned, we would like to refer you, Mr. President, to paragraph 243 to 254 of our pre-confirmation brief. Now let me turn to crimes committed at Sedad. After 31 August 2013, Mr. Said and other former Selekas of OCRB were transferred to Sedad, which is also situated or located in Bangui, as you can see on your screen. You can see the external wall of Sedad and the main entrance. And this image again was collected by prosecution staff on the ground in 2016. Mr. President, Your Honors, Sedad was only democratic by name because at least between the 15th of September and or around 8 November 2013, at least 33 persons who were considered to be Bozize supporters were abducted and detained in the small cells at Sedad by Mr. Sedad and his collaborators. The modus operandi at Sedad was also the following. It is described in paragraph 64 of the DDC, and it entailed victims being abducted at their homes or in the streets and violently forced into vehicles. The vehicles had tinted glasses and had no license numbers. Known in Quebec as ghost vehicles. The victims would be hooded and beaten, and in some cases, chili powder would be added to the hoods, and that would burn the eyes of the victims. Quite often, the arrest patrols would go around Bangui to ensure that the hooded victims would not be able to locate the areas to which they were being taken. Sedad had to be dissimulated from the public and excluded from any judicial oversight. The Sedad location or premises was surrounded by high walls, and it was difficult to identify it as a state agency or a detention center. The judiciary, including the police and the public prosecutor, did not have access to Sedad. Arrests themselves were not only arbitrary, but victims were in all aspects deprived of the application of the law throughout their detention at Sedad. Their detentions averagely lasted 1 week, but in some cases would extend to several weeks. Victims were detained in small cells in disastrous conditions, and I draw your attention to your screen. I also point out that these photographs were taken in December 2013, about 1 month after Sedad was shut down or closed. The cells were small and overpopulated or overcrowded. The cells had no toilets. There were no medical facilities at Sedad. Food and water were not provided in sufficient quantity for the detainees. The detainees were regularly interrogated by Seleka, and quite often violently, in regard to their presumed status as Bozize or anti-Balaka supporters. The detainees were not formally charged, and their detention was not subject to any judicial control. Victims were also not authorized to contact their family members. The family members did not receive any information and would search for their relatives as best they could. Some went to the radio to seek information. Others went to the mortuaries to find out if their relatives had died. They had no information and so thought that their relatives or close ones were dead. These essential facts support the count of imprisonment and other inhumane acts. Your Honors, the prosecution recognizes the particular suffering of members of families by including the idea of other inhuman acts. The suffering by these members is so grievous that it bears similarity to the charges or to the acts covered by Article 7 of the statute. In this regard, I refer you, Your Honors, to our brief at paragraph 306, 311.
The family members were not only left to their own devices without contacts or information, but they were also threatened and even tortured if they managed to find the site of a Sedat, as experienced by one witness. And with your permission, Mr. President, I would like us to go to private session.
Mr. Court Officer, let's move to private session, please.
We're back in open session, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Prosecutor.
Merci.
Thank you. During their detention, the victims were physically and mentally mistreated to such a point that their treatment can be considered as torture. The detained persons were severely beaten with wooden planks and rifles during questioning. Others were burned with hot irons and left standing in the sun and hooded for hours on end. At least 10 detainees were tied up according to the Abatata Cha method. As it has already been said, this method is consistent with the crimes of torture, but also to the crime of outrages upon human dignity. The crime of persecution was also perpetrated against the victims in Sedat. The victims were deprived of their fundamental rights. They were taken as targets for political, ethnic, religious, or sexist reasons. For the detainees in the OCRB and the Sedat detainees, those in Sedat were almost exclusively Central African men, Christians from the Baya, Banda, and Manjia ethnic group. The specific discriminatory intention is highlighted by the model of criminal behavior and also as described by the statements given by the Seleka of Sedat during the relevant period. Mr. President, Your Honors, the evidence established also that there are sufficient grounds to believe that the crimes of imprisonment, torture, cruel treatment, other human acts, outrages upon human dignity, and persecution were perpetrated against the detained persons, and that other inhuman acts were perpetrated against their loved ones who were not informed about their fate. The criminal individual responsibility of Mr. Said Abdel Kani, and it can be described as follows. Mr. Said is accused of having provided all assistance possible in the commission of crimes in Sedat under Article 55.3 In the alternative, Mr. Said is reproached for having contributed in all manners possible in the commission of crimes by a group of people acting in concert under Article 25(3)(d). Many insider witnesses stated that Mr. Said directly contributed to the crimes charged. Remembers that Mr. Said was regularly present and sometimes even slept at Sadat. Witness P3029 also saw blood on the clothes on the ground in the compound, which confirms once again the poor treatment inflicted at Sadat. Neighbors to the Sadat compound reported having heard the cries of people who were being maltreated. Lastly, the compound was small and its cells were visible both from the entrance and from the building containing the offices. It is inconceivable that a person frequently and regularly at the Sadat would not have noticed that the detainees were there. Mr. President, Your Honors, I will conclude. It is our submission that on the basis of the essential facts presented in the DCC, supported by our list of evidence, and as summarized in the pre-confirmation brief, it is necessary to confirm the charges and all the modes of responsibility for the ascertainment of the truth. It will be necessary to refer Mr. Said for trial. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prosecutor. So, it's almost 4. Thank you for finishing before 4 p.m. Now, the schedule for tomorrow will be that I will give the floor to the Council for the Victims, to the Council for PCV. And for tonight, I think this is all. I would like to thank everyone, and especially all the court staff, our interpreters, the technical staff, and everyone who's contributed to this hearing. We will see you then tomorrow at 9:30, and have a nice evening. Thank you very much.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.